So my name is Eddie O'Neill. I'm a product manager on the platform team. I work closely with, I'm kind of Ilya's counterpart on the Facebook side, where he comes from the Parse side. I have kind of product responsibility for a lot of the things we do with developers that use the Facebook platform around our SDKs on iOS and Android, our graph APIs, platform insights, and a bunch of other stuff like that. What we're going to talk today about is Facebook sharing. And to kind of frame this up and like set a little bit of context, I want to kind of draw a distinction between Facebook login and Facebook sharing. Login is all about, like we talked about just a second ago, getting people quickly into your app with a with an identity that you know is authentic. Essentially with a name, a first name, last name, and user ID that you haven't seen before. And when they come back to your app, like you know you're kind of continually dealing with the same person. So login is all about that. We think about login as separate from sharing. Sharing is something that is all about two things. It's all about giving people that use your apps the ability to tell stories to their friends on Facebook. And it's all about people who see those stories on Facebook being able to click on those stories and engage with your app. So we think about sharing as a way to drive traffic and growth back into apps on mobile and on web. And what we're going to spend I don't have my phone on me anymore, but Ashley's going to kill me if I go past 3 o'clock. What we're going to spend the next 30 minutes or 29 minutes talking about is this box on the left and sharing. And fundamentally, and there's a bug in this slide, I'm sorry. I updated these with the most recent numbers that Mark talked about, but the title's wrong, so I apologize. This is why we're here. There's 1.19 billion MAU on Facebook and 874 million MAU on mobile. And this is why we're here, because this is the audience that you can reach, whether it's through the paid side, through app ads that we just talked about, or through the I guess you could kind of call it organic, but the people and users engaging with your apps and then driving that traffic from your apps back. Do I need to use this? Is this better? Oh, driving traffic back to your apps. Sorry, I'm not a huge handheld mic fan. So stories that show up on Facebook from apps look like what you see here. So they show up in desktop, they show up on mobile, and we do a lot of work to make sure that they only show up on the platforms where you actually have apps, so that clicks that come back to your app are meaningful. And the anatomy of a story looks like this, before we get into kind of the specific things where we talk about how we share stories. The anatomy of a story looks like this. You have my name at the top, so I'm the one who's telling the story. You have this message that I can type, and so in both of these cases I've typed some message that kind of contextualizes whatever app content this is for my friends that see this in newsfeed. And then you have a bunch of content that comes from your apps. You have a picture, and like we just talked about, pictures are really engaging. People love pictures. It gives them some visual sense of what you're up to or what the thing that you shared is about. Next, we have a title and a link. And you can't see the link, but the link is really important because the link is the thing that allows people to click on these things in newsfeed or on timeline and come back to your apps. The title's important because the title kind of gives me a sense of what this thing is. Is it a book? Is it a movie? Is it a picture of a place? Is it a restaurant? All that kind of stuff. The title of a New York Times article, on the right-hand side here. We have a description, which is kind of a multi-line thing that's in a little bit lighter text generally. But the description is something that kind of lets me read a little bit more about this thing. It might be the caption of the photo that I typed on Flickr. It might be the first couple lines of an article from the New York Times. But this description gives me a little bit more of a sense of what this content is and kind of do I want to click on it or not. And one of the things that we find with apps is when they fill out these descriptions, it's best to create an engaging description. And in the same way you would kind of test your ad content, your ad copy, to see which things convert better, you have the same sort of concerns here. Test the content of these things and make sure that it makes sense to people and converts well. And then finally, and perhaps to you most importantly, is app attribution. And the app attribution is this little via your app name. It is clickable, so I can click that and get to your app. But what it does is that everyone that sees this story in newsfeed or on timeline kind of starts to understand what apps I'm using, what kinds of content come from those apps. And so if we rewind a few years and talk through the history of how we have evolved sharing on Facebook, we kind of have good, better, and what we think of as best. On the left-hand side here, this is good. This is a web-rendered dialog that has a somewhat unfortunate name of feed dialog, but it is for sharing a story. It is a web-rendered dialog that a lot of apps, especially games, use to let people share content from apps into Facebook. It's great. It works on any device. Downsides of it are it is web rendered, so it takes some time to load CSS, JavaScript, and HTML down to this page and display it. The UI isn't awesome. That is something that is fixable, but the UI isn't awesome. The other downside is that in all of your apps, if you are not using Facebook login, I have to type my username and password. And so I don't know about you, I'm sure a lot of you are like this. I have dozens of apps on my phone, and I just get tired of typing my Facebook username and password into every one of those apps in order to share a cool article or a photo or a pin from Pinterest or whatever. So this dialog kind of has that downside. And as my password changes because I just updated it, because Facebook saw abuse in my account, because my account was compromised and I asked Facebook to reset my password, this dialog has a bunch of downsides because I have to go back in and retype my password every time I want to use it. Fast forward to the integration that we did with Apple in iOS in 2012. This is the share sheet. It's awesome. It has great UI. It's 100% native. It has a pretty good user experience. And because I type my username and my password into my phone knows who I am, and so it can kind of pick up that identity in every app. But it does have some downsides too. It doesn't let me tag people. It doesn't support open graph and rich storytelling. And it doesn't support app attribution. So if we fast forward to the thing on the far right, the share dialog is this thing that we launched on iOS in May and on Android in August that lets third-party apps, your apps, cause the Facebook app to open with a bunch of app-provided content that fills out the story that we just talked about, that anatomy of a story. And it puts people in a great degree of control around tagging people, tagging place, configuring an audience, typing a message, seeing a very precise, very accurate kind of preview of the content that's going to be shared with their friends when they share. So key features of this dialog, and this is the dialog in kind of its full glory. It's really easy to integrate. It's as easy to integrate on both iOS and Android as it is to take the like button and drop it into a web page. It's fully native, so you don't have this like wait time while you're waiting for all this content to come down from the web. And it lets you tell rich stories by configuring pictures and text and links, and then if you want to kind of opt into Open Graph sharing, using Open Graph. So taking a quick kind of cruise through these things, and I love this quote from Goodreads. They were so used to kind of high friction integration points with us around sharing an API and login. With the second sentence here, I kept thinking I was missing something, but everything was running smoothly. Like that's exactly the kinds of experiences you're starting to see us enable in mobile. And it takes this 2-line block, depending on how you want to count, 2-line block of code. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, if we count the braces at the end. Takes a URL and asks the SDK, the Facebook SDK, to present the share dialog. And then when either I can post that content from the Facebook app or I can cancel if I want to come back to the app. When I come back, this callback handler is the thing that gets invoked. And there are some kind of changes to this to like add image content. If you have code that you want to make sure that the dialog can actually be opened on a particular device, you can kind of make this more complicated. But as it's at its like simplest integration point, this is what it takes to use the share dialog. Sharing does not require login. So we see a lot of apps that use login. That's awesome. We love that. We hope that you're getting great value out of login. But if your app doesn't have a login system, or you choose simply not to use login, or you want to enable sharing for users that choose not to log in with Facebook login, this is a good example of an app, 4 pics 1 word, which is this game that puts up 4 pictures, and then I have to fill in the word that is about these pictures. And the little blue F to the kind of right-hand side of that fill-in box pops open the share dialog. And so the app provided a bunch of great content here. Can you help me guess this word? This many letters. Here's one of the photos, and then I can share this to my friends and like get help with filling out this word in the game. Lots of changes they could make here to improve this, but it was a very easy thing for them to integrate, and it doesn't require login. This app, as far as like my using of it, doesn't even have a login system. Tagging friends, tagging location, and app attribution. So we kind of talked about these things a little bit, but these are the things that show up inside the red boxes. So when you see with so-and-so, Vlad and Doug and Mike, in the red boxes, that's tagging my friends. And when you see at, where is this, high five star pizza, that's a place. And when we do feed ranking, when the ranker looks at choices that it can make about content to show your friends in newsfeed, some of these things act as pretty high signal things for us. Because it's interesting when I can go and see that my friends are off at some place doing a thing. And so tags are a really important thing to creating engagement inside Facebook and newsfeed. And so we want to put people in control, and there's some of this stuff that your apps can kind of configure, but then we want to also put the user in control and let people that are using your apps fill out this stuff here if they want to, even without any additional approvals or talking to us or any of that kind of thing. And then on the app attribution side, we see another Pinterest story here via Pinterest. And I can tap on that and go to the app, but the share dialog natively supports that kind of app attribution. And then support for rich open graph stories. Back on that anatomy of a story picture that we looked at, there's one thing I left off of that, and that's this open graph robotext. And robotext is this kind of structured sentence that is a verb and a noun. So Eddie listened to a song, watched a movie, read a book, bought a thing, hiked a trail. In this case, yeah, Prashant hiked a trail. It kind of is open graph is a really rich way for you to help your users tell stories on Facebook without having users have to type all of this stuff into that little message field. So when the content shows up, we can display the story like this, and it's kind of a more engaging, richer story than just a basic link share where we go scrape a page for a title and an image. So key features, I think you've got all this, and I'm running out of time. So it supports iOS and Android, a couple of lines of code to integrate. It does not require login, has attribution, is 100% native. The next one's really important. We consider stories that come through here kind of an equivalent of somebody typing this same sort of thing into a composer inside the Facebook app. So we think of these as what we call explicitly shared. And if you're familiar with Open Graph, you'll be aware of this. There's a little box you can check when you're configuring the stories that you tell with Open Graph, where you can say that these stories are explicitly shared. By default, everything that comes through the share dialog is already marked as explicitly shared. And so that's kind of another one of these powerful signals to us that kind of distinguishes it from a song that you listen to. We know that things that you share explicitly like this kind of have a high value to whoever to me when I go share it. Supports friend and place tagging and Open Graph. So if we look at an end-to-end example here, this is Pinterest. Here's a pin. I decide I want to share it on Facebook. It fast tap switches to the Facebook app, and you see this third panel which is the share dialog, where you fill out any additional information that you would want to kind of put in that story. And then I click post. I come back to the app, and then this is the story that my friends see. And all of this, again, with a couple of lines of code, and is a pretty rich story. That story on the far right-hand side is actually pretty good. A bunch of leading apps are already using this. This slide's a little bit old. There are a bunch more that have kind of joined us with share dialog, and are seeing what we think of as pretty good results with it. So if I do a quick demo, can we switch over to my phone? So I love this projection of the phone onto the screen. This is just awesome. So here we're sitting in Pinterest. I already did a search for the keyword climbing. If you couldn't tell, it's something that is it's a hobby of mine. I'm going to share this pin to Facebook. And so here we are inside the Facebook app, and I get exactly the composer that you would see if you sat down inside the Facebook app and wanted to share something from the app to your friends. You get this exact same experience from third-party apps, which we think is pretty awesome because it gives people are familiar with that flow. They know what to do there. They know how to tag their friends and tag places. They know how to set an audience, and gives people a lot of control over the story. And so we see those same kind of pieces of the story here. There's a link behind the scenes, title text, an image, a description, and a little bit of information about the app. I will set this to friends. And we will say, and share. And so that shares to Facebook, and then switches back to the app. And all of that transition magic, if you're familiar with iOS 6 and previous versions of iOS, we can switch back to slides. Thanks. You know that those animations were kind of this like funny thing that did this. iOS 7 has made those a lot better, and they're these much faster, seamless transitions as you kind of slide apps around. So that transition has gotten a lot better, and so the experience is a lot less jarring to people who are sharing this kind of content from apps. And all of that under the covers is kind of handled by the Facebook SDK to open the Facebook app, do all of the sending the data over the wire, bringing the response back, unwinding it all, getting back to your view controller, and giving you control and calling your callback back. So let's like quickly cruise through what it takes to set one of these things up. So on iOS, we configure some metadata in the plist. And unfortunately, we have to duplicate the app ID because Apple doesn't allow you to kind of alias variables in the plist. So we have to do both of these entries and dupe the app ID. On Android, that app ID is set down in a strings XML file, and we pick it up from there through the Android manifest. Second, and this is a pretty important step that a lot of people miss when they're getting started with this, it is possible to open the dialog without doing this. It is not possible for us to call you back effectively, like to have the Facebook app come back to your app without doing both of these steps. So on iOS, the top one configures a handler for the open URL. And so when the Facebook app calls your app back, this code runs. And there's a couple of lines of code in here that come from the Facebook SDK called FB app call. And that helps us do a bunch of work to kind of pull apart login calls that come back to your app. And pull apart any of the additional contextual information that might come back from the Facebook app in response to a deep link. This handler is really important to handling login, deep links, and responses back from the Facebook app for the share dialog. Incidentally, you'd have to do the same thing if you were implementing the autofill dialog that we saw in the last session. And on Android, it's a very similar thing, although it's a little bit more verbose. In your activity, you have to go implement a bunch of on handlers with the UI lifecycle helper to kind of help us reconstruct all that state depending on whether and how your activity got opened and closed. The callback that happens is in on activity result, and so when the Facebook app comes back to your app, on activity result is the thing that gets invoked. And then finally, opening the share dialog. Again, two very simple scenarios with link shares. Open graph shares are very similar. Top one is iOS. It's a URL with a present share dialog call. And the bottom one is an unfortunately different URL, but is the same sort of thing in Android. And both of those would cause the fast app switch to happen, and then the callbacks to come back, depending on whether or not the user chose to post or cancel. So a few kind of tips and tricks. One, use large images wherever possible. So if people share content from your apps that have pictures, use images that have these that are at these dimensions, and those stories show up really well in Newsfeed. And the code to do that, to share user-generated photos through the share dialog, is this block at the bottom, where you basically configure a bunch of UI images or the equivalent in Android, and pass those onto either the action or the object, because we only support photo sharing through Open Graph. Pass those either on the action or the object, and those things show up in the share dialog in a way very similar to kind of the pictures that we've been seeing here so far. Two, use deep linking. How many of you, I'm actually really curious, of the people that I can kind of visually see, how many of your apps support some form of linking scheme right now? Okay, so like a 40%-ish. Deep linking's kind of awesome because it helps us get back to your app with, when people see a story like this in their apps and they click on it, I expect if I have the app installed to land inside the app and see something that relates to the thing that I clicked on in Newsfeed. And deep linking is what helps you do that. And so when I land inside the app, you can take this URL that we hand you back, pull it apart, open the right view controller, fill it up with all the right data that you got from parse, and show it to me. And I get a really great engaging experience. And from that, I can kind of pivot into other parts of your app. I might go explore other photos my friends have shared, other recommended articles if you have a set of recommended articles when I'm done reading the one that I'm reading. It's a great way to engage the user once they're already inside your app. It's also a great way to drive installs. And so it's organic, like people have to choose to install the app. But when I click on one of these and I don't have the app installed, we pop open the store. And whether it's the App Store or the Play Store, we give people a choice whether or not to install those apps. And you may see us testing some new pieces of UI on iOS that give people a choice when they click on these things, and they can say, I want to open this content on the web if you're an app that has a website as well as a mobile app. I want to open this content on the web, or I want to install the app. And so it's super intentional from a user experience perspective. It puts users in a lot of control, whether or not to install your apps and how to kind of open that content. But at the end of the day, they have the ability to kind of experience that content in whatever way you present to them. And so I'd suggest that you kind of create as engaging of an experience as possible when you receive those clicks to us. 3, share photos from the device's photo roll. So this has been something that in the past, in order to share photos to Facebook, you had to integrate login. You had to get people to click the login button. Then you had to ask for their permission to publish back to Facebook. And then you had to make the API calls to publish photos. The code to do this I don't have in this app directly, but it's, I don't know, it's more than 3 lines long. It's probably closer to 10, because there's a little bit of configuration you have to do to set up the photos you want to send to us and what kinds of photos they are. But you can read photos kind of off of anywhere, like whether it's the web or the local photo roll, or images that are stored inside your app, or a screenshot of a game, and that kind of thing. But you can take all of those things and attach them to stories and send them through and have them displayed in Newsfeed, again, without using login and with just a couple of lines of code. Not worrying about access tokens, not worrying about error conditions and all that kind of thing. So this is a really powerful way to get started with sharing photos from apps, without having to deal with that sort of complexity. 4, Open Graph helps you make stories engaging. And so when people ask me, when should I use Open Graph? What I tell them is, you can start with link shares. Link shares give you a lot of control over how a story looks in Newsfeed. Move into Open Graph when you want to tell really, really rich, engaging stories for people, and this is a really good example. So here's a story Pete shared. It's a book, Moneyball. I've read it. Some of you guys probably live in the Bay Area, so you've probably read it because it's about the Oakland A's. Pete typed a user message here, great, with an exclamation point. There's a description, so this is a really good description. Kind of gives me a little bit of a sense like what this story is about. And there's app attribution with Goodreads. But when I look at this, I don't really know why Pete is sharing this. Did he buy it? Did he read it? Did he watch it? Did he rate it? Did he give it to somebody as a gift? Like, why is Pete telling me about this? And so with Open Graph, again, more complex to integrate, but a much richer experience for people in Newsfeed, I get a lot better experience here. I get this kind of auto-generated text based on what you configured through the Open Graph config tools when you described the rate action and the book noun, so we can generate this story, Pete Wild rated Moneyball on Goodreads. Because it's structured data, we have a way to kind of pass a much richer set of information along with the story. And so that's the 5 out of 5 stars. So we can put a star rating here. That's kind of awesome. I get all the same stuff around a title and a link and a description and an image for the story. So the story's still really good. And then we attached a facepile to it. And that facepile says, you and 13 friends have this in your books collection. A pretty great story. Like, I can walk down the hall to any of these people and say, hey, I saw you read this book. Can I borrow it from you? Or what did you think of it? Or did you see the movie? And so it just kind of creates this ambient awareness for the viewer to understand how this story is socially contextualized, not just between them and Pete, but between them, Pete, and their friends. 5, use Insights to track your metrics. Insights is a really important product that I think is kind of underutilized right now. Insights helps you understand how the content that comes into Facebook is generating engagement and driving traffic back to your app. And it may generate engagement only inside Facebook in the forms of likes and comments. It may also generate clicks back to your app, which is what you see here. So here you see an app that has a number of stories that have been published, a number of impressions, and a number of clicks. And then a little bit of trend information about how that has, how their numbers have changed over the last, I don't remember, I think this is a week time period. And then a breakdown of clicks by platform. And so I can sit here as a developer and look at this and say, I seem to be getting more clicks on Android than on iOS. I wonder if that's because more shares on Android versus iOS. I wonder if that's because my sharing flows on iOS are harder to find or harder to use, or there's a bug in them or something like that. So there's all kinds of like interesting information you can glean out of this if you think about insights in the context of what people are experiencing on Facebook and then what your app is doing across all of these different platforms. And finally, I think this is my last tip, so I'm actually going to be a little early. Finally, falling back to the feed dialog. So obviously, this whole thing we've talked about around the share dialog only works if the Facebook app is installed on the phone. And the Facebook app is installed on an awful lot of phones. And so this dialog has a lot more reach even than users, the number of users that are logged into iOS. This dialog still reaches more people because of the breadth of installs of the Facebook app on iOS and Android. If the dialog isn't installed, you still have options. You can turn off sharing. You can check to see if the app is installed. So that's what this, if you look at the bottom, there's an if FB dialogs can present share dialog with params. This lets you check to see if on this particular device for this particular user, you can present the dialog on the right. And if you can't, you can choose what to do. You can turn sharing off. You can, which kind of has a set of downsides. You can open the feed dialog, and so unfortunately these two stories don't match, but you can cause the feed dialog to open, and then that gives people a chance to log in and still share that content. And again, like we talked about at the beginning, one of the upsides of feed dialog is it works on every app. It just has the downsides related to login. So you kind of have a lot of control here for how to handle situations where the Facebook app doesn't happen to be installed on the device. And so that's kind of all I've got. I know you guys are going to stick around for a while and hack, and that's awesome. Use parse, and if you have Facebook SDK, if you give the Facebook SDK and the sharing stuff a shot, I'll be around and people will be able to find me. So if you have questions either about this or kind of anything else related to platform or whatever, feel free to grab me and we can talk through those. It's a little weird to not be doing questions because I actually love walking through Q&A. So I'd love to talk to a bunch of you in the next few hours, once everything else wraps up. So with that, I will hand it back to Ashley.